All right, boys and girls, I'm Ben Domenech. You're listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. Happy to be here with senior editor Chris Bedford, also of the Federalist. And we're happy to be joined by author JD Vance, who is here to talk to us today about all sorts of things. He is a bona fide conservative intellectual. We have very little conservative intellectualism on this podcast in a typical environment. And so it's a real pleasure and joy to have you with us today, JD.
Thanks for having me.
I first off have to ask this question, which is obviously on the minds of people who are aware of your interest in Ohio. Are you going to be running for Senate there? Do you have a specific plan on when you would announce that or how you would let us know?
Well, I'll give a very politician answer. I'm thinking about it very seriously.
Okay.
That's what's happening right now. No, I definitely am interested in doing it, and I don't have all the time in the world to figure it out and to announce. I've set up an exploratory committee just because we're sort of starting to do the things necessary to operationally to get a campaign in order. But I think I'll declare either that I'm in or out July-ish.
Okay.
Just to make sure that, you know, we have the time necessary to actually run a campaign. The primary's in May, so I don't have all the time in the world, but I have a little bit.
You're just trying to make sure you've got the money and the name recognition, because it seems like those were delivered pretty early by the success of your book and the friends and those who've been attracted to your work.
Yeah, money and name recognition, not huge concerns. I would say just running a campaign, especially when you've never done it for the first time. I mean, I've been living and breathing this for the last 4 weeks. It's kind of like starting up a new business, where you got to make sure you have the right people, you have to make sure you have the right infrastructure in place, you have to have this person doing this thing and that person doing that thing, and that's just something I want to make sure I do the right way. Because if I do this, and I have a not very nice life, just turn my phone off there, but I have a very nice life, and so if I'm going to take the sacrifice of running for office, I want to make sure that we do it in a way that's actually worthwhile.
You don't have as many campaigns under your belt as Josh Mandel.
I have not run for office as many times as Josh Mandel.
So one of the things that we know historically when it comes to the U.S. Senate in particular is that there's a long history of intellectually interesting, smart people who come into the body and then find it frustrating.
Sure.
And even if they have long careers, such as Daniel Patrick Moynihan did, they end up, being known more for what they did perhaps before they got to the Senate or outside of the Senate, as opposed to what they did in the Senate. I think there are a lot of people who would target someone like Ben Sasse as being a very smart, intellectual guy, also someone who seems to be very frustrated by just being a senator and everything that requires. What do you think about your own goal, were you to get into this, to avoid the pitfalls that other smart people have run into when they've joined this august body that seems to be a lot less about actually getting things done these days?
Well, my sense of a lot of people who are so frustrated by it is they go into it without an appropriate dose of cynicism. I'm just being honest. I mean, you got to recognize that a lot of people who work in politics, especially on the periphery, are actually scumbags.
Yes.
And if you don't think that...
You're already way ahead of like a number of intellectuals who've come to Washington. So, but continue.
And I think, the other thing is my sense of intellectuals who come into politics is they think that they can persuade the other side, right? That I'm just going to be smarter, I'm going to have better arguments, and I'm going to turn Chuck Schumer into a diehard conservative. And I think if you recognize that actually the real battle is about power and winning, and certainly you can persuade people, but those are people in the middle, those are voters, that when you're actually in this town, your job is to do something. Your job is to fight the existing power structure that exists in D.C. And if you go into it with that recognition, again, with that healthy dose of cynicism, I think you can actually get things done. The other thing I'd say is this is a really interesting moment for our movement and our party. And I think that one of the things I would be trying to do is advancing an idea for what conservatism will mean in this 21st century that's dominated by an oligarchy that hates conservatives and hates conservative values. And in that environment, maybe having some new ideas about where we go might not be so frustrating. It might actually be invigorating.
Now, but there's a million reasons, it seems at first from the outside, to just throw rocks and bottles at leadership in the Senate on both the Democratic and Republican side. The base responds well to that. But as you get closer to it, you start to realize that people like Mitch McConnell don't have no arrows in their. They have a bunch of arrows in their quill. They can cause damage. They can help. They can hurt.
Quiver, not quill.
Yeah, excuse me, quiver. Don't quibble. The amount of
Continue
money
your
that they have, the amount of staff that they can give you access to, the amount of actual positions where you're not just a backbencher can be great. But at the same time, they're significantly more interested, at least Mitch McConnell, in judges and putting money and campaign finance reform or stopping that and foreign war, which aren't some of the things that you've been pushing for yourself. So do you have any relationship with these types of people as Mitch McConnell or Senate Majority or any of the Senate Minority leadership team? And how would you approach that? Were you to run for Senate and become a senator?
I wouldn't say I have super close relationships with really anybody in the Senate. I've been pretty close with Josh Hawley. Always been a fan of his. I'm decently close with Tom Cotton, and both of these guys have offered me a lot of good advice in the past few weeks. I've talked with Mitch McConnell. I certainly wouldn't say that we're super close. But my intuition on the actual operation of the Senate is that it's very hard as a new senator to get everything that you want, even amendments added into bills that are ultimately going to get voted down. It's actually not that difficult to get a few things that you want. So part of the game is, I think, focusing and knowing how to leverage what influence you have so that you get a little bit of what you want, so that you focus on the issues that really matter. And I think if you're trying to boil the entire ocean as a new senator, it is harder. But I think, I'm going to pick my battles and focus on the things that I really care about.
One of the things that has happened over the last couple of decades is that we've seen an imbalance created in knowledge in Washington between the administrative state, the bureaucracy, and the legislative branch.
Yep.
That basically, in part, unintentionally, because of the reforms that came out of the Contract with America and other things that were designed to shrink staffs on Capitol Hill, you end up with staffs that are mostly youngsters who don't really know what they're doing. They're a couple years out of college, or people who are just looking to go and lobby for somebody after they're done to make money. And on the flip side, you have these bureaucrats who view themselves as the subject matter experts, who actually run the show, run Washington, and determine what happens. So when you have a president like President Trump, they just put their foot on the brake, they prevent anything, they try to slow everything down. And when they have a president like Joe Biden, they just run full speed ahead.
Right.
What can be done to change that dynamic? Because to me, that seems like a systemic problem that ultimately lends itself toward more government power, more consolidation, more power concentrated within Washington, and less power to the localities and to the states, which, regardless of the issue, tends to lead itself to more leftist policy.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, the only thing that comes to mind is I do think that more of the people who work on Capitol Hill need to be better at the actual details of public policy, which I think means you probably need more policy staffers in the offices of senators and representatives. I think it also means you need more representatives and senators who actually care about the details of public policy. I mean, part of the issue that I have with the Senate, just as a body writ large, is that a lot of people use it as a self-promotion platform. Very few people actually want to do the job and get things done once they're there.
It's becoming more like the House that way.
Yes, absolutely. But I do think that so long as you have a situation where the average Capitol Hill staffer is a 29-year-old and they're taking a meeting, and you know this better than I do, but they're taking a meeting with 9 lobbyists, right? And those lobbyists have very discrete expertise and focus on an issue, and they tend to overwhelm the actual function of the legislature. And I think that to do that, you actually have to provide better people and get more people who are focused on public policy in the actual offices of some of these senators.
You see, it's suicidal. You see how many Republican candidates issue press releases, or senators and congressmen, saying how much money they gave back to the Treasury at the end of the year. Later turned out that a lot of that money was just going to a slush fund for badly behaving politicians. But meanwhile, they're getting crushed by the administrative states experts and the Democrats experts. They should be doubling their budget, and they should actually do oversight. But what attracts you about going into this body that has so much of this problems? Because we have seen in the last year, the federalism really working quite well for conservative values. There's an open governor's seat in Ohio that's coming up. What attracts you to the Senate as opposed to a governorship where you could maybe impact more change nationally?
Well, I think first, the issue that I'm most focused on, I'm most worried about right now, is the control over our technology oligarchy over both our culture and our economics. It's not just that these people censor our speech and control what we're allowed to say. It's also that the entire digital technology sphere has an overwhelming amount of authority in how capital gets allocated in our economy. Like our economy is just too focused towards the digital world, not focused enough on the real world. That is fundamentally a federal problem to solve. Ron DeSantis has done some really cool things in Florida vis-a-vis big tech, but I worry that a lot of that is going to get federally preempted. And even what he's already done, even if it doesn't get preempted by a federal bureaucrat, is going to be harder to actually, it's already within a pretty narrow range of action. These are fundamentally big international and national issues. You need better legislation and better legislatures at a federal level to solve these problems. I think that the state governorship is an incredibly important position. Obviously, I live in Ohio. I raise my kids there. I care a lot about who the governor is. But right now, the issues that I wake up thinking about as a private citizen are almost all federal questions.
You have a unique perspective as someone with the lived experience that you have regarding the way that the opioid crisis and drug crisis in America has played out. I'm someone who definitely has been of the mind that either legalization or more likely decriminalization was something that needed to happen at some degree. I'm now more reevaluating that in a lot of different respects.
Sure.
You see it out front.
Given what we've seen happen particularly and explode during this pandemic. I mean, I think at the end of the day, and I could be wrong about this, we may end up in a situation where deaths of despair or deaths from overdose end up being a massive portion of the actual body count from this pandemic.
Yep.
I am concerned that this is an issue that seems to have no real truck in Washington, that they don't seem to really care about, because a lot of the people who are doing this, frankly, aren't voters anyway. They aren't people who are, part of a significant constituency. They're on the edges of society, or they've been left behind by our economy. What would you do in any role, or what would you think ought to happen to try to address this problem from Washington?
Yeah, so one, I think it's worth talking about why so few people in Washington actually care about the problem, because it will kill approximately 100,000 people. Those are people who are mostly young. Unlike most COVID deaths are coming from the very old. You talk about a 30-year-old kid dying of a heroin overdose, you're losing a ton of future life. It's a very, very big issue. I agree with you. I think the pandemic and some of our response to it has exacerbated it. We'll probably see more deaths of despair because of it. But I think it's actually really fascinating, and it helps understand much about the mentality of the modern left, why we're not talking about this problem more. One obvious solution, one obvious thing you could do to reduce deaths of despair, I mean, there's the pandemic lockdown question, set that to the side because I think it's been covered so much. One obvious thing you could do is actually get control of the southern border, because fentanyl has exploded over the last 3 months. The amount that's coming into communities like mine has exploded, which means more young people are going to die of those problems. That's more children orphaned. That's more grandparents being forced to pick up the load and take care of children they weren't planning to take care of. It's an unspeakable human tragedy, but people would rather talk about the poor people, and yes, many of them are poor south of the border who want to come to America, but I'm sorry, they're not our people. Our people are the ones who are suffering the most from the fentanyl who are coming in to our communities, and that should be our first priority. The other interesting, just rhetorical thing that you hear about, or that I think we should hear more about, is like, what is the white privilege discourse really do? What is its function? What is its purpose for people in power? And we know, of course, that opioid overdose, while they touch all walks of life, they are disproportionately concentrated among working class white Americans. And if you're talking constantly about white privilege, I think what you're doing is you're using that as a cudgel against people who are really suffering, whether they're overdosing themselves or their communities are affected by these drugs, and it gives you an excuse to ignore them, which is, again, I think it's worth saying and worth repeating that the constant accusation of privilege levied against working class white people is a way for the powerful to ignore their problems. So why aren't more people over here on Capitol Hill worried about it? Because they're being taught by every institution of our culture that people dying of heroin overdoses are actually privileged and advantaged because of their skin color. I think it's really, really disgusting. What to do about it is very tough. I mean, I do think that the first step of solving the problem is a supply issue. What's really unique about the opioid problem is that it's a supply issue. People have always done drugs. They drink too much, they smoke weed, whatever the case may be. Opioids are uniquely addictive, and they're uniquely deadly for those who are addicted to them. So I think getting control of the southern border, making sure that we eliminate first introduction to opioids and prescription pain pills for people who don't need them and who aren't yet addicted to drugs. The statistics I've seen is that in the United Kingdom, they prescribe about 1/6 the number of opioids as we do in the United States. I don't think that anybody can say that the people of England are in 1/6 as much pain as the people in the United States. So I do think that we have to get control of the supply issue. That's the first part of it. And until we do that, you're going to continue having people dying. But again, first step is you've got to get people in D.C. to actually care about the problem. And that's a big step.
I remember back when you were widely liked and popular, everyone from the libertarians, I saw your book at Koch conferences and
I was the only person who didn't like it.
I loved it.
Now you tell me. I would have come over here.
I'll circle back to that in a minute, but go ahead.
Two of the negative style reviews that I saw, which were outnumbered by the positive style ones, were ones that criticized you for saying that people could improve their own lives, and said you don't know anything about the circles of poverty. I don't think they'd read the book. And then the other one was just like woke 22-year-olds who said, "How dare you talk about white people's problems?" Correct. Back then, those woke 22-year-olds, I remember looking at that as like in salon and thinking, how stupid is this? And now it's everywhere. Yeah. It's absolutely everywhere. And also, as you've actually tried to turn your story into how do I help my neighbor, you've become significantly less popular with certain segments of American society. How have you've been on this journey from the beginning, since talking about this and bringing up this subject? Now things are big conversation pieces on Tucker Carlson and other places. Tell me about that walkthrough and why you think that these things have changed and how this has gotten so broad so quickly since just a few years ago.
Yeah, no one's ever asked me this question, actually. So, I mean, I think also part of the psychology, just to be honest, is that, I was a critic of Trump in 2016 and I was a voter of Trump in 2020. And I think that there was always this weird way where it's like, well, so long as this guy doesn't love Trump, we're okay with him. And as soon as that changed, then I became a little bit more politically threatening. But I think, fundamentally what happened is the book came out. Most people responded, present company excluded, positively to it, apparently. And, that was true across the political spectrum, right? It was like the populist conservatives liked it, Steve Bannon liked it, the libertarians liked it, and even some people on the left liked it. What really happened for me psychologically is that I, because of the book, got invited in a ton of very fancy places and conferences. I talked to a lot of very powerful people. And I'll never forget... The first time that I ever met Tucker Carlson was at a J.P. Morgan event where
his favorite,
where I listened to what he said and then he listened to what I said, and we both found each other and were like, "Oh my God, you're the guy who's exactly right about what's going on in the country," and I. Ever since then, have thought to myself, the person who is most challenging to the worldview of people who I think are harming communities like mine is Tucker. And there are a lot of people who agree with him, but nobody quite has his megaphone. And I think one of the things that I picked up on starting even a few years ago is that people would only like me to the extent that I didn't go on a show, that I disavowed him, that I criticized him publicly for this or that thing that he said. And it sort of made me realize that when elites are threatened, they close ranks and they try to destroy the people who are threatening to them. And it was just sort of a choice. It's like, look, I'm going to be on the side of the people that I came from, or I'm going to be on the side of this sort of Borg of elites that are trying to get me to assimilate into them. And my choice was, I'm going to continue to be loyal to the people who made me who I was. And it's not, to your point about the book, I don't think it's an easy solution. I don't think that the problems in my community are easily solved by just sort of a populist approach on economics or culture or whatever the case may be. But I do think at a fundamental level, we have to change the ruling class in this country if we're going to make the lives of the people who grew up in my community better. And that's, that's not something obviously a lot of people like to hear, but because I keep saying it, they get mad at me. And I'll keep saying it. They'll keep getting mad, and I'm sure it'll come to a head eventually.
So the lack of you saying that was my problem with the book. My problem with the book was that I felt it was this incredible story, which I thought was certainly valuable and everyone should read. And then you took some things out of that story, but I felt like you didn't get to that ultimate point of the need to establish essentially a new elite. There's always going to be an elite in the country. We need a new elite. Now, that's not what the book was for. And you wrote it, obviously, in advance of this. And so it became something that it actually wasn't, which was it became, this is your explanation for the Trump voter.
Right.
And I heard so many people in New York City in particular, you have to read that book because it explains the Trump voter.
Sure.
I was like, the people around those people are the Trump voters. Those people actually don't vote. They're so outside of society. And so my problem with it was actually just that I think that you have basically done in the time since you published the book the thing that I was waiting for.
So you
as
wanted
I
a
was
sequel.
Basically, I guess I'm not a big sequel guy. But,
yes, you are.
But I guess yes. This was New Hope without Empire.
That's fair. That's fair.
This is Batman Begins without Dark Knight.
Right.
And so I just was waiting for that next part, and I feel like in part your acceptance into that elite community of people who were curious about this for an instant before they became incurious and just decided they were all racists and Nazis.
Correct.
That actually, I think, was the most powerful thing to come out of the book. Is that development ultimately led to your ideas becoming a confrontation with this ruling class that has failed its people so terribly for so many years.
Yeah, no, that I think it's totally fair. I mean, to your point, the book wasn't really meant as like a large scale political reflection on things, right? I was sort of trying to understand like what's going on psychologically, what's going on mentally, what's going on spiritually in the community that I came from, without really tracing it to root causes as much as just sort of trying to explain what was going on. And I think you are right. There was like this 2-week period where everyone, even sort of liberal New York Times columnists, were trying to understand, like, we clearly missed this, right? We thought Clinton was going to win. She didn't. Trump won. Maybe we're wrong about some other things. Maybe we're wrong about how terrible these people are in the middle of the country. And again, that lasted for like 2 weeks, and then it was either it was they're bigoted and racist, or Russia, and that was it.
Russian memes made them.
That self-reflection was so short.
Absolutely, like my aunt and uncle, right? They were doing fine. They were good people, and then they saw a meme about that was generated by Russia, and Jesus endorsed Donald Trump. He's like, all right, we got it. No, that's right. No, it was, but again, it taught me something about elite culture that was really valuable for me to learn, and apparently valuable for other people to learn too. Because I think the ruling class is okay with people so long as they're not threatening, and as soon as they become threatening, then they start to attack you. I think probably Josh Hawley has learned his own version of this in the last couple of years in a much bigger and overriding way than anything I've experienced, where they like literally tried to cancel his book from getting published, and they tried to destroy the guy's life. I think,
if you rewind a few years ago, he was speaking at Aspen.
Exactly.
So it's one of these things where the
zoo animal's dangerous.
Oh yes. Whoa. As long as conservatives stay in the mist, then we'll study them.
That's right.
But once they come out of there, but to me, that makes your story a lot more powerful in this moment, because what we have seen rise up in a lot of circumstances in the last decade or so, since the Tea Party, basically, is a lot of people who are populists, but essentially come from backgrounds that have been untouched in large part by the worst aspects of the American life today.
Sure.
They're familiar with it because they're a step or two removed.
Yep.
They have a cousin, they have a friend, that kind of thing. One of the big aspects of this that I see in terms of the political culture is the divide that has emerged in recent years between families that have people who are serving in the military and families that do not. And what you see is an increasing political divide there that didn't exist historically. You used to have people who were in New York City who, had tons of relatives who were serving in the military. That's not true anymore. And those people are coming back from these wars with PTSD, with mental health issues, with pain issues that they treat in multiple different ways. And there seems to be no real appreciation for that in Washington. What could be done to change that issue going forward in the long term? Because it's something that certainly President Trump kind of broke it open, but that's all he really did, was he broke open the conversation around it. From my perspective, the swamp essentially was able to push back against him to such a degree.
He picked the fight versus every single commanding height all at once.
Essentially. And that was something that I think he wasn't really able to deliver on to the degree that a lot of military families, even apolitical ones, would have liked.
Well, I think part of the answer is that the next time that we get power, whether it's in the Senate or the House or the presidency. I mean, we're talking President DeSantis in 2024 or President Trump round 2 in 2024. I think the thing that we have to take away from the last 10 years is that we really need to be really ruthless when it comes to the exercise of power. I was talking about this with someone earlier today, where you remember there was some threat that congressional or Senate Republicans made. If you get rid of the filibuster, we're going to do X, Y, and Z. And you actually look at it, it's like, oh, this is not that interesting.
We're going to actually deliver on our promises that we've made for decades.
Right? Sounds fun.
This is the threat. If you get rid of the filibuster, we're going to do this stuff. Like, they're talking about expanding the Supreme Court. They're talking about adding 2 senators from heavily Democratic places.
You get rid of the filibuster, we'll actually deliver on defunding.
We'll do what the base has been telling us that we don't want to do.
Yeah. So I think, look, I am a cynic about this and maybe even a little bit of a pessimist, but I think the challenge confronting American conservatives is that we have lost every major powerful institution in the country, except for maybe churches and religious institutions, which of course are weaker now than they've ever been. We have lost big business, we've lost finance, we've lost the culture, we've lost the academy. And if we're going to actually really affect real change in the country, it will require us completely replacing the existing ruling class with another ruling class. I say that knowing and hearing myself, it sounds really hard. It is really hard. But I don't think there's like a detente with these people. I don't think there's sort of a compromise that we're going to come with the people who currently actually control the country. Unless we overthrow them in some way, we're going to keep losing. And that's the challenge. Now, it's not easy. It requires us to build institutions. It requires us to support, alternative media institutions and alternative media programs. It requires us to elect different people at all levels of government. And it requires us to be willing to use the power vested in our constitutional republic to go after some of our enemies in big business. Those things are all really hard, but I don't know how else to do it.
And there's a huge amount that the Senate can do, a federal level can do to go after universities. You could stop the federal money that's going to universities. You could reform student loans, which have just allowed them to put generations of kids into massive amounts of debt to fund absolutely garbage education with no answerability on that. You can go after their ability to import fully paying children of sheiks and Chinese Communist Party members to come to the country and learn and then leave. There's a lot of different things. What are some of your ideas on tackling this university system and or trying to free some of these breaks that we have, these holes that the left has on the commanding heights of culture and American society?
Yeah, so just start with the universities. I think a couple of things that we can do is we could tie any federal money to not teaching the critical race theory stuff and not teaching the gender theory stuff. Orban in Hungary effectively made it such that you cannot teach radical gender theory in Hungarian universities. If you do, you don't get any money. We can do that in the United States. Easy. It's a legislative fix. Maybe it actually doesn't even need to be a legislative fix. Betsy DeVos actually flirted with doing this just with her power as Secretary of Education. Of course, people will go insane, but often when they go the most insane, that's when it's the most valuable. The second thing, you mentioned student debt and universities. I see an interesting symmetry that exists in our society right now, which is $1.7 trillion of student debt owned by American citizens, $1.7 trillion of wealth in university endowments. If we want to solve the student debt crisis, we don't pass their debt off to taxpayers, which just lets the universities off the hook. Make the universities pay for the debt bomb they've created for the millennial generation. Make them pay. You could tax the university endowments. You could also, by the way, not just university endowments, but we should be going after the entire lefty nonprofit infrastructure that's completely exempted from any of the same pressures that exist in the American right. If I go and invest in something, if I invest in a stock, I have to pay taxes on any appreciation that stock gains. If you're a university endowment or the Ford Foundation, you're completely exempted from that tax, even though what Harvard really is at this point is a massive hedge fund with a crappy woke university attached to it. We treat Harvard as if it's like doing God's work. It pays no taxes. It faces no pressure from the federal government. That's just one issue. But again, this where I say we have to be willing to ruthlessly use power. You would need people who are willing to say the things that I'm saying and actually legislate in accordance with them. That's the hard part.
So I want to take the opportunity to ask you to respond to another conservative intellectual. This is from Ross Douthat's. This is Decadence, right, Emily? Yes. Most recent book. I interviewed him about this actually in January, right before the pandemic began. I asked him at the time what it felt like to be the last conservative hired by the New York Times. And he said, oh, no, that's not true. And I think it's true. Anyway, this is just from a portion of that book, and I want you to respond to it. Close Twitter, log off Facebook, turn off cable television, and what do you see in the Trump-era United States? Campuses in tumult? No. The small wave of campus protests, most of them focused around parochial controversies, crested before his election and has diminished since. Urban riots? No. The post-Ferguson flare of urban protest has died down. A wave of political violence? Sort of, but one that's more analogous to school shootings than to the political clashes of the 1930s or the 1960s, in the sense that it involves disturbed people appointing themselves as knights errant and going forth to slaughter rather than organized movements with any kind of strategy or concrete goal. Internet era political derangement is obviously partially responsible for all kinds of horrors. And he goes on to basically just say that we're deluding ourselves. This is not reality, etc.
Yeah.
Obviously, he wrote that before the past year and a half.
Sure.
Yeah.
I don't think it stood up well, personally. I think that, in fact, there were some of the seeds of this beforehand. Ross is a very smart guy, and he's come on many times before and will come on again, and I'll ask him about it too. But I kind of wanted to get your perspective on this, about why that kind of prediction, which I think a lot of conservatives, smart conservatives, shared at the time, that basically you're fooling yourself, you're looking too much at Twitter, you're looking too much at Facebook. In reality, things are better than that. Things are not breaking down in America the way that you think they are. Now, I think we ought to reconsider, why did so many smart people kind of miss what was going on?
Yeah, no, that's my overall critique of that passage, and my guess is that Ross would rather have that one back. I think that he's right that what's been going on in American society for the last 30 or 40 years has been more stagnation than outright decline. I think that's starting to change, and that's really my critique, is that what's really gone on the past 2 years starting to feel like accelerating social tension, violence, decay, not just a kind of stagnation. Things aren't really getting that much better, but they're not getting that much worse. I really do think they're starting to get much, much worse.
Yeah.
I think that the overarching critique that I would have of that, though, to Ross's credit, I don't know that he would disagree with this, is we get too caught up in the statistics and not enough in what's actually going on in people's lives. For 100,000 people to die every year of heroin overdoses in the wealthiest country in the world, that should say something that's like something's really broken. For the American birth rate, for us to have gone from a society where people have enough children to pass on the next generation to a society where we're literally unable to replicate ourselves. Like, what does that say if your society doesn't have babies and kids in it? That's pretty icky and pretty gross. Now, the statistics, if you look at them, they say, well, we're consuming a little bit more this year than last year, and last year than the year before. But I think the evidence of what's going on in people's real lives is that the country is in a very dark place, and it's frankly getting worse.
Yeah, that crisis seems to me to be hitting almost every aspect of American life, in the sense you see now rising inflation, the decline in birth rates, I think, is incredibly disturbing. It indicates a nation that has significantly less hope for its future.
Yes.
On a very personal level.
Yes.
Just do we, because people don't have those kinds of conversations in the way that conservative sociologists have them.
That's right.
They have the conversation about, do we really want to bring another kid into this world?
Yep.
Into this country? And it's not about, the knobs that are twisted in Washington so much to make things less or more expensive. It's a lot more about the way they feel about the direction of the country. That's such a cultural aspect, though. Mm-hmm. It's not something that one politician or one elected official really has the ability to change. So beyond your involvement in politics, what can we do as a culture in our personal lives, or as just conservative neighbors or inhabitants of communities, to start making those small differences that can give people hope and that can make them say, actually, we should have one more kid?
Yeah. So a few weeks ago,
question, I know.
Yeah. So on Twitter, I mean, I think that the one good thing about the policy, and I agree that the levers actually don't matter that much from a brass tacks material perspective, but can at least send the signal that we're the sort of country that cares about this stuff again. And I think, this again, to sort of point to something that Hungary has done, they've achieved some pretty positive birth rate improvements over the last 10 years, but it hasn't just been the policy, it's been the signal sent by the policy that, like, children and babies are good, we owe something to our country, we owe something to our future, the best way to invest in it is to ensure the next generation actually exists. So I think sending those signals via policy, but the cultural messaging of politicians is important. I also think, just to be a little stark about this, I think we have to go to war against the anti-child ideology that exists in our country. Mm-hmm. A few weeks ago, no, Twitter is not real life, but I forget even what caused it, but there was this ridiculous effort by millennial feminist writers to talk about why having kids was not a good thing, why they were glad they didn't have kids, and even encouraging people who had children to talk about why they regretted having children, which of course is like
Mother's Day hook.
On Mother's Day, which is like psychologically deranged to ask mothers on Mother's Day to talk about why they regretted having children. And what it made me realize is that so much of what drives elite culture is mediocre millennial journalists who haven't gotten out of their career what they thought they would, right? And the thing is, everybody can be an exceptional mother and father. Not everybody can be an exceptional journalist at the New York Times. And not enough people have accepted that if they put their entire life's meaning into their credential, into where they went to school, into what kind of job they have, if you put all of your life's meaning into that, you're going to be the sort of person who asks women to talk about how they regret having children. You're going to be a sad, lonely, pathetic person, and you're going to know it internally, so you're going to project it onto people who have actually built something more meaningful with their lives. I think we have to go to war against that ideology and the people behind it, because we need to say to the people in my hometown, I've seen this with, just to be honest, with my sister. I love my sister is just the best person. I love her to death. And sometimes, she'll say things to me like, maybe I should have delayed having kids. Maybe I should have went to school. Maybe I should have did this or that. And it's like, Lindsay, you've been a great mom. Your children are happy. They're healthy. You've taken good care of them. You've shown me, she was my older sister. She took care of me a lot in a very chaotic home. People like my sister should not feel like the cultural messaging is your life is inadequate. The people who are sending that message should feel that their life is inadequate. And of course they do. They're just too ashamed about it to talk about it.
You're talking just right now about childbirth and actually where you actually find fulfillment. And that brings me to something I'm interested in about you. The changes you've gone through in your life and what brought you to the Catholic Church and your conversion there. And this is something, granted, it is under attack, but it's not in decline. There are problems, there always have been in the Catholic Church, but it's not in decline, and there is a real link all the way back through thousands of years of saints to the past, what matters, what's sacred, what's real. What brought you to the Catholic Church in your own life experiences and the influences you had, and where, do you see that playing any part in what you're talking about right now, or the things that can help this country?
Sure. Are you guys Christians or Catholics?
I'm a Catholic.
Okay. So I grew up in very religious family, but we didn't go to church that much. I watched a lot of John Hagee and a lot of Billy Graham and folks like that on TV. And I think that when I started, and I kind of had the classic upwardly mobile kid, went to a university, lost my faith, started to feel like it was something that only stupid people believed in. And then, when I was like probably in my early 30s, started to think, okay, there are questions asked and answered, offered about human nature that I got through the Christian faith that are just better than the alternatives. And that sort of re-engaged me with my faith. Got very serious about it and started thinking, okay, if I'm going to be a real Christian again, what would that look like to me? And there are all these complicated intellectual or psychological reasons I could give you for why I decided to become a Catholic. But I think the main thing, if I'm being honest with you, is that the Catholic Church has this remarkable view of history, right? It's been around for 2,000 years. It's gone through various peaks and valleys. There have been times when the Catholic Church has been a bunch of ragtag, people who were sort of on the outskirts of Roman society, all the way through the commanding heights of world power. And I think what that sense of rootedness and oldness gave me is a feeling that Christianity really is timeless. And my attachment to the faith should not be rooted in a view that somehow there's going to be a victory for Christian values in this generation or even in my lifetime, but that there's something timeless and eternal about this. And maybe my role in this whole struggle is to make it easier for Christians to live their lives, or maybe my role in this whole struggle is to be a really good advocate at a really bad time. And, I might not see, the country may not look, in other words, the way that I want it to look in 30 years. It may get much worse. We may find Christians persecuted, not just in cultural ways, but in actual physical ways. But that's what being a Christian sometimes has been about. And your faith is in Christ, and your faith is in the long term. It's not in these sort of short term fluctuations and what happens. Anyway, that's a long answer, but I just felt very rooted in the Catholic faith in a way that I hadn't in the faith of my youth.
I think that's a great answer to end on. JD Vance, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on the Federalist Radio Hour.
Thanks, guys.
I'm Ben Domenech. You've been listening to another edition of the Federalist Radio Hour. We'll be back soon with more. Until then, be lovers of freedom and anxious for the fray.